The muddy waters of the Colorado River churned beneath the worn planks of Yuma's bustling trading dock as Ethan Mitchell watched the morning sun climb above the eastern hills. His weathered fingers traced the pearl handle of the revolver that had been his constant companion for 30 years, its familiar grip offering little comfort on this particular dawn. The railroad surveyors would be arriving today, and with them would come the vultures, men who saw opportunity in others' misfortune. Behind him, the newly constructed River Queen Hotel cast long shadows across the waterfront. Its owner, Alexander Turner, had built the establishment just 6 months ago, sensing the changes that would soon sweep through this once quiet river trading post. The hotel's gaudy architecture stood in stark contrast to the simple wooden buildings that had served the community for generations of riverboat traffic. Ethan had watched Yuma grow from a handful of mud brick buildings into a crucial waypoint between California and the Arizona Territory. Now 58 years old, his reputation as the fastest gun west of the Colorado had begun to feel more like a burden than a badge of honor. The wrinkles around his eyes had deepened, and his once black hair had turned steel gray, though his aim remained deadly as ever. The sound of boots on wooden planks drew his attention. Benjamin Roberts, a young man barely past his 25th year, approached with the cocky stride of someone who hadn't yet learned that speed wasn't everything in a gunfight. His new boots and pristine gun belt marked him as a recent arrival, probably drawn by the rumors of fortune that followed the railroad's westward expansion. "Mr. Mitchell," Benjamin called out, his voice carrying a hint of challenge that made several nearby dock workers pause in their labors. "I heard you're the man to see about settling disputes in these parts." The younger man's hand rested casually near his holster, but Ethan noted the slight tremor in his fingers, a tell that revealed his nerves despite the confident facade. What neither man knew was that their encounter was being observed from the hotel's upper balcony. Noah Phillips, a well-dressed gentleman with calculating eyes, watched the scene unfold with keen interest. His manicured hands held a leather-bound ledger filled with names, dates, and carefully calculated odds. For months, he had been orchestrating these confrontations, using the railroad's expansion as cover for a far more lucrative enterprise. Frances Turner, Alexander's wife, stepped out onto the balcony beside Phillips, her face tight with concern. "Another one?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. She had watched Phillips arrange these deadly games since he'd first arrived in Yuma, claiming to represent the railroad's interests while actually running an elaborate betting operation that spanned from San Francisco to St. Louis. Down on the dock, Ethan fought the urge to simply walk away. He'd seen too many young men like Benjamin Roberts, full of fire and foolish courage, thinking they could make their reputation with one well-placed bullet. But the rules of this world demanded a response, and behind those rules lurked men like Noah Phillips, pulling strings Ethan had only recently begun to understand. The morning crowd began to gather, drawn by the familiar tension that preceded violence. Among them stood Jacob Perez, the local telegraph operator who served as Phillips' unwitting instrument, spreading word of these confrontations to gamblers in distant cities. Each message he sent sparked a flurry of wagers, though he never suspected his role in the larger scheme. Clara Mitchell, Ethan's daughter, watched from the doorway of their small trading post, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her father's reputation made him a constant target. She had begged him to leave Yuma, to find peace somewhere far from the railroad's influence, but they both knew that running would only delay the inevitable. The game would follow them wherever they went. The river's steady flow provided a constant backdrop to the unfolding drama, its waters carrying flatboats and steamers laden with goods bound for settlements upstream. The commerce that had built Yuma continued unabated, even as the railroad threatened to make the river trade obsolete. Progress, Ethan reflected, had a way of destroying the very things that made progress possible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Yuma's dusty main street as Ethan Mitchell watched a group of railroad surveyors marking territory near the riverbank. Their presence meant more than just progress. It signaled the approaching storm that Phillips and his financial empire were brewing. The aging gunslinger's weathered hands absently traced the worn pearl handle of his revolver, a habit born from decades of vigilance. Clara emerged from the trading post carrying a leather-bound ledger, her footsteps causing the wooden planks to creak beneath her feet. "The numbers don't lie, Father," she said, placing the book before him. "Our river trade is down 30% since last month. The railroad's mere presence is already changing things." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to read both books and men with equal precision. In the distance, Benjamin Foster's steamboat rounded the river bend, its whistle piercing the afternoon quiet. The young captain had become a regular sight on this stretch of the Colorado, and Ethan had noticed how his daughter's eyes always seemed to find the vessel when it passed. Benjamin represented everything the railroad threatened, the independence of rivermen who had built their lives on the water's ebb and flow. A cloud of dust approached from the Prescott Road, resolving into a single rider on a bay horse. Noah Parker, barely 25 and already carrying a reputation that drew blood money, rode into town with the casual confidence of youth untested by time. Ethan recognized the type. He'd been one himself once. But Noah was different. There was a calculated precision to his movements that suggested training rather than experience. Inside the Riverside Saloon, Alexander Phillips' agent Jacob Turner sat at his usual corner table, nursing a whiskey while his eyes tracked every movement through the window. His telegraph forms lay scattered before him, each one a thread in Phillips's vast web of manipulation. The man's presence had become so common that most locals had forgotten he wasn't always part of Yuma's landscape. Clara watched Noah dismount, her expression darkening with recognition. "He's one of Francis Walker's men," she whispered to her father. Francis, the widow who controlled the largest shipping company in Globe, had been losing cargo contracts to the railroad for months. Her alliance with Phillips wasn't common knowledge, but the Mitchells had learned to recognize the signs. The young gunslinger made his way toward the trading post, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Behind him, Helen Martinez, Phillips' personal courier, slipped into the telegraph office, another piece moving into position on the unseen chessboard. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Ethan could feel the machinery of Phillips's scheme grinding into motion. Benjamin's steamboat docked as Noah reached the trading post's porch, creating an unintended audience for whatever was about to unfold. The river captain secured his vessel and started toward the trading post, his usual delivery forgotten as he read the tension in the air. Clara's hand found her father's arm, a gesture that spoke volumes about their shared understanding of the moment's gravity. The wind carried the sound of more horses approaching from Flagstaff's direction. Reinforcements, perhaps, or witnesses carefully positioned to add credibility to whatever tale would be telegraphed to distant gambling dens. Ethan had seen too many of Phillips's orchestrated conflicts to believe in coincidences anymore. Noah cleared his throat, his young face carrying an expression too practiced to be genuine. "Mr. Mitchell," he called out, "I believe you're holding something that belongs to Miss Frances Walker." The accusation was thin, transparent even, but it didn't need to be believable. It only needed to provide the spark that Phillips' carefully arranged kindling required. Ethan felt the familiar weight of his gun, the tool that had kept him alive through decades of similar moments. But this time, the weight carried a different significance. It wasn't just his life in the balance, but the future of everything he and Clara had built along this river's edge. The game had changed, and surviving the next few minutes would require more than just being faster on the draw. Behind Noah, Jacob Turner had emerged from the saloon, his pencil already moving across a fresh telegraph form. The story was being written before it had even happened, and Ethan finally understood. This wasn't just another challenge to his reputation. It was an elaborate production, with every participant playing their assigned role in Phillips' grand performance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Ethan studied the gathering crowd. He'd seen enough staged confrontations to recognize the telltale signs, the strategic positioning of random onlookers, the whispered exchanges of currency between strangers, the practiced nonchalance of men who'd rehearsed their roles. Phillips had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a theater director, and every participant knew their mark. Clara stood in the doorway of their trading post, her knuckles white against the wooden frame. She'd witnessed enough of these moments to know this one was different. The usual code of the frontier, the unspoken rules that governed even violent encounters, had been replaced by something more calculated, more insidious. This wasn't about honor or territory. It was about profit margins and telegraphed headlines. Noah shifted his weight, and Ethan caught the glint of something unusual on the young man's gun belt, a small brass token, identical to ones he'd seen changing hands in Prescott's gambling halls. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Prescott's dusty main street as Ethan Mitchell watched the young gunslinger stride into town. There was something peculiar about the way the newcomer carried himself. Too deliberate, too practiced, as if following stage directions in some grand performance. From his vantage point in the saloon's second-floor office, Ethan could see what others missed. The subtle glances between seemingly unconnected observers positioned at key points along the street. Benjamin Turner, the railroad's ambitious young surveyor, sat across from Ethan, spreading maps across the weathered oak desk. "The line has to come through Prescott," he insisted, tracing his finger along proposed routes. "The river access makes it ideal for moving materials." But Ethan was only half listening, his attention drawn to the street theater below, where the young gunslinger, he'd heard the name Jacob Roberts whispered, was making a show of asking directions to the saloon. Frances Mitchell, Ethan's wife of 20 years, noticed his distraction from her position by the window. She'd grown accustomed to reading the subtle shifts in her husband's demeanor that signaled trouble brewing. "Another one?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Ethan nodded grimly, his weathered face a mask of resignation. This would make the fourth challenger this month, each one younger than the last. The true puppet master behind these orchestrated confrontations was Alexander Phillips, though few knew his name or face. From his elegant office in Globe, Phillips had built an empire around staged gunfights, using telegraph lines to coordinate bets across territories. He employed scouts to identify aging gunfighters, then sent young prospects to challenge them, controlling odds and outcomes with the precision of a chess master. The river trade had transformed Prescott from a sleepy outpost into a bustling hub of commerce and opportunity. Steamboats brought goods, travelers, and ambitious men seeking fortune, but they also brought men like Noah Perez, Phillips's local representative, who moved through the saloons and gambling houses collecting intelligence and placing strategic wagers that would maximize his employer's profits. Helen Turner, Benjamin's sister and the owner of Prescott's finest hotel, had been watching the pattern unfold for months. She'd seen too many good men fall victim to Phillips's schemes, though she'd only recently pieced together the true scope of his operation. The railroad survey work brought her brother to town regularly, giving her a confidant who shared her growing concerns about the shadow falling over their community. As dusk approached, Clara Roberts, no relation to the young gunslinger, hurried through the gathering crowd to Ethan's office. As the telegraph operator, she'd intercepted messages that confirmed her suspicions about the coordination of these chance encounters. "They're betting heavy in Flagstaff and Yuma," she whispered. "The odds are shifting fast." Her hands trembled as she passed Ethan a decoded telegram. The pieces of Phillips' elaborate game were becoming clearer to Ethan. The railroad survey wasn't just about planning new routes. It was providing cover for an extensive betting operation that used the proposed lines to move information and money. Benjamin's maps showed more than rail paths. They revealed a network of telegraphs and way stations perfect for coordinating fixed fights across the territory. Alice Perez, Noah's wife and an unwitting player in her husband's schemes, provided the final piece of the puzzle when she sought out Frances in distress. Her husband's gambling debts weren't debts at all, but rather a complex system of payoffs and percentages. The supposed losses were actually profits being funneled back to Phillips in Globe, where they were reinvested in ever larger betting pools. As night fell over Prescott, the various threads of Phillips' web became visible to those who knew where to look. The young gunslinger taking up position in the saloon, the telegraph operator sending coded messages, the railroad surveyors suspiciously detailed maps, and the riverboats bringing more than just cargo, all parts of an intricate machine designed to turn violence into profit. The evening air grew thick with tension as Ethan considered his options. He could face Jacob Roberts tomorrow as expected, playing his part in Phillips' production, or he could begin pulling at the threads that held the criminal enterprise together. Either way, he knew the next sunrise would bring more than just another gunfight. It would force a reckoning that would reshape the future of Prescott and the entire territory. Behind closed doors, Benjamin and Helen Turner worked late into the night, cross-referencing telegraph records with railroad survey dates. They discovered that every major gunfight in the past year had coincided with supposed survey work, creating perfect cover for Phillips's operators to move through the territory undetected. The railroad's expansion wasn't just changing the landscape, it was providing infrastructure for a criminal empire. The first hints of dawn crept across the horizon as Ethan made his way through Prescott's muddy streets toward the telegraph office. He'd spent a sleepless night piecing together the fragments of Phillips's scheme, And the picture emerging was far more complex than simple fixed fights. The betting operations were just the visible surface of something that reached deep into the territory's economic foundations. Benjamin Turner met him at the door, his normally pristine suit wrinkled from hours of investigation. "There's more," he whispered, ushering Ethan inside where Helen sat surrounded by stacks of paperwork. "The railroad surveys aren't just cover for moving money. They're mapping the future. Every town where Phillips has staged a fight has seen land values triple within months of the railroad announcing new routes." Helen spread a map across the desk, her fingers tracing lines between marked locations. "Look here. Flagstaff, Globe, Yuma. The pattern's clear as day. Phillips isn't just profiting from the fights themselves. He's using inside information about the railroad's expansion to buy up land before prices surge. The gunfights are smokescreens, drawing attention away from the real operation. Outside, the town stirred to life as merchants began setting up their stalls for market day. But Ethan noticed something different in their movements. A nervous energy, an expectant hush. Word of the upcoming fight with Jacob had spread, and already he could see men exchanging quiet words and handshakes that spoke of wagers being placed. "Francis saw Phillips meeting with 3 railroad executives last night at the River Queen," Helen continued, referring to her trusted source among the Saloon girls. "They were celebrating something, talking about a major land deal closing next week in Globe. Whatever's coming, it's bigger than just tomorrow's fight." Ethan studied the map, his weathered fingers following the railroad's proposed route. "Jacob's no fool. He must know he's being used just like I am. Question is, whose side is he really on?" The young gunslinger had appeared in town too conveniently, his challenge too perfectly timed with Phillips's other movements. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they watched as Alexander Phillips himself rode down the main street, his expensive Eastern suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the dusty surroundings. He wasn't alone. 2 well-dressed strangers flanked him, their bearing suggesting more than simple business associates. "Railroad men," Benjamin muttered, recognition flickering across his face. "Noah Webster and his brother from the territorial office. They control all the land grants from here to Yuma." The implications hung heavy in the air. Phillips had connections reaching far beyond local corruption. Helen gathered their evidence into a leather folio, her hands trembling slightly. "Clara at the land office sent word. There's been a surge of property purchases all along the proposed rail line. Shell companies, false names, but all leading back to Phillips through a maze of papers. He's building an empire piece by piece, using blood money to fuel it." Ethan watched Phillips and his companions disappear into the Prescott Bank, his mind racing through possibilities. Tomorrow's fight wasn't just about him and Jacob anymore. It was a crucial piece in Phillips's elaborate game. The question wasn't who would win the gunfight, but how its outcome would serve the larger scheme. As if reading his thoughts, Benjamin placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You can't face Jacob tomorrow. Phillips has too much invested. He'll never leave the outcome to chance. We need to expose the whole operation before more blood is spilled." But they all knew it wasn't that simple. Phillips had spent years weaving his web of influence through every level of society. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the office windows. In just 24 hours, Ethan was supposed to meet Jacob in the street for what the town thought would be a simple matter of honor. But now he understood. Every shot fired in Prescott echoed through a carefully constructed chamber of corruption. Each death another note in Phillips's symphony of greed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Prescott's muddy main street as Ethan Mitchell's weathered boots carried him toward the inevitable. His silver hair caught the amber light while his eyes, sharp despite his 60 years, tracked the gathering crowd. Word of the impending showdown had spread through the riverport like wildfire, drawing spectators who whispered and pointed at the legendary gunslinger. Benjamin Turner, barely 25 and cocksure, lounged against the hitching post outside the Riverside Saloon, deliberately making a show of checking his pristine Colt revolver. The young man's crisp black vest and polished boots marked him as a city slicker, but the notches on his gun belt told a darker tale. His challenge to Mitchell had come as no surprise. It was the 4th such confrontation this month. What neither man knew was that Alexander Phillips watched from his second-floor office above the bank, a thin smile playing across his face as he adjusted his gold pocket watch. The railroad baron had orchestrated this match carefully, placing substantial bets through intermediaries in Flagstaff and Yuma. His network of informants had spent weeks feeding both men carefully crafted stories designed to bring them to this moment. Helen Perez observed the unfolding drama from behind the lace curtains of her boarding house, her heart heavy with the knowledge she dare not share. As Mitchell's confidant and the keeper of his darkest secrets, she alone knew the truth about Phillips's scheme. The railroad magnate had been staging these duels for months, using the river trade routes to move money and information while manipulating proud men into deadly games. Clara Roberts, Phillips' unwilling accomplice and bookkeeper, had smuggled proof of his machinations to Helen just that morning. Ledgers showing massive betting pools and telegrams revealing how he engineered each confrontation. But Helen couldn't warn Mitchell without exposing Clara to Phillips's wrath. The young woman's brother Jacob was held hostage in Globe, insurance against her silence. The crowd parted as Frances Turner, Benjamin's sister, pushed through with desperate determination. Her pale blue dress was stained with river mud, evidence of her frantic ride from Flagstaff after discovering her brother's true reason for coming to Prescott. She knew Phillips had deliberately inflamed Benjamin's pride with false tales about Mitchell disrespecting their late father. Mitchell felt the familiar calm settle over him as he moved into position, his bones aching with the knowledge that this dance was becoming too familiar. 4 challengers in as many weeks, each younger, faster, more eager than the last, each carrying a carefully crafted grudge that somehow led them to Prescott's Riverside thoroughfare. The pattern had been nibbling at his consciousness for days. Benjamin's fingers twitched near his holster as a riverboat whistle pierced the tension. The young man's eyes burned with manufactured hatred, fueled by Phillips' poison whispers about Mitchell's supposed role in a land swindle that had ruined the Turner family. The truth, that Phillips himself had orchestrated their downfall, remained locked in Clara's ledgers. Noah Roberts, Clara's brother, watched from his prison in Globe as Phillips' men prepared another telegraph designed to provoke yet another gunfight. His captivity had opened his eyes to the elaborate web of manipulation. How Phillips used the railroad's expansion and river trade to move his pawns across the territory like pieces on a chessboard, all while profiting from their deaths. The moment stretched like molasses as Mitchell and Benjamin faced each other. But something had changed in the old gunslinger's stance. Helen's subtle warning sign, 3 taps on the boarding house window, had confirmed his suspicions about Phillips' involvement. The question now was whether he could find a way to break the cycle without joining the growing list of Phillips' victims. Benjamin's hand moved for his gun with the speed of youth, but Mitchell had spent decades learning to read men's souls in their eyes. He saw past the anger to the confusion beneath, a young man beginning to question the too convenient story that had led him here. Mitchell's own draw was deliberately measured, designed to buy precious seconds. The shots, when they came, shocked everyone with their trajectory. Mitchell's bullet knocked Benjamin's gun from his hand, while the young man's shot went wild, a result of last-second hesitation as Francis's scream pierced his concentration. But the third shot, fired from the shadows near the bank, struck Phillips' office window, shattering his perfect view of his staged spectacle. Alice Mitchell, Ethan's daughter and Prescott's telegraph operator, had been quietly gathering her own evidence of Phillips's scheme. As chaos erupted in the street, she released a flood of telegrams to law enforcement in Flagstaff, Yuma, and Globe, exposing the elaborate betting operation and the manipulation of grieving families for profit. The carefully orchestrated showdown dissolved into something entirely different as Mitchell and Benjamin found themselves fighting side by side against Phillips's emerging henchmen. The old gunslinger's experience paired with the young man's speed made them a formidable team, buying time for Helen and Clara to reach the sheriff with their evidence. Frances and Alice worked together to coordinate the arriving lawmen from neighboring towns, their combined knowledge of telegraph codes and Phillips' operations proving invaluable. The river that had carried Phillips' blood money became his undoing as boats arrived carrying federal marshals who had been quietly building a case for months. Mitchell's final shot of the day wasn't fired at a young challenger, but at Phillips himself as the criminal mastermind attempted to flee aboard a waiting steamboat. The bullet found its mark in the man's shoulder, ending his reign of manipulation and bringing a different kind of justice to the frontier than anyone had expected when the day began. As Phillips lay wounded on the steamboat deck, the true scope of his operation began to unravel. Helen and Clara emerged from the telegraph office with stacks of coded messages that revealed an intricate network stretching from Flagstaff to Yuma, with dozens of manipulated gunfights that had lined Philip's pockets while leaving a trail of dead men across the territory. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the river dock as lawmen began the painstaking process of piecing together years of calculated deception. Benjamin stood at the water's edge, his young face now bearing the weight of understanding how close he'd come to becoming another of Philip's pawns. Mitchell approached him slowly, holstering his gun with hands that showed the slight tremor of age and exhaustion. The two men who had nearly killed each other hours before now shared a silence heavy with mutual respect and the recognition of how fate had intervened to reveal their common enemy. Frances worked tirelessly through the night, her fingers flying across the telegraph key as she coordinated with operators in Prescott and Globe. Each message brought new revelations about Phillips's network: corrupt judges, compromised lawmen, and a web of informants who had helped him stage his deadly theater. Alice assisted her, translating the more complex codes while maintaining a detailed ledger of names and dates that would prove crucial in the coming trials. The river itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the sun rose the next morning, its waters carrying away the last vestiges of Philip's influence. Helen organized a group of townswomen to provide food and coffee to the tired lawmen, while Clara helped sort through the mountain of evidence being assembled in the sheriff's office. The town was beginning to wake from its long nightmare, though the scars of Philip's manipulation would take time to heal. Mitchell found himself drawn to the saloon where it had all begun, now empty save for Benjamin, who sat nursing a whiskey at the bar. The young man's gun belt lay beside him, its holster empty, a symbolic gesture that spoke volumes. The old gunslinger pulled up a chair, ordered 2 drinks, and began sharing stories of his own youth, of mistakes made and lessons learned the hard way. Benjamin listened intently, occasionally offering insights that showed wisdom beyond his years. As news spread along the river communities, more victims of Phillips's schemes came forward. Widows whose husbands had died in staged gunfights, merchants who had been forced to pay protection money, and young gunslingers who had been manipulated into fights they couldn't win. Frances and Alice worked to document each testimony, building a case that would ensure Phillips and his associates would never again prey upon the desperate or ambitious. The town began to transform in the following days. The railroad crews, no longer under Philip's corrupt influence, resumed their honest work. Helen and Clara established a committee to help those who had lost loved ones to Phillips's schemes, while Benjamin found purpose in helping Mitchell train a new generation of lawmen who would protect the river communities with honor rather than intimidation. The aging gunslinger himself faced his own transformation. The weight of years spent as an unwitting pawn in Philip's game had taken its toll, but in Benjamin he found not just an ally, but a successor of sorts. Together they began patrolling the river routes between Flagstaff and Yuma, their presence a reminder that justice had finally returned to the territory. As autumn approached, the last of Phillips's conspirators were rounded up. The federal marshals praised the town's resilience and the unlikely alliance that had brought down the criminal empire. Frances and Alice's meticulous records ensured that restitution would be made to as many victims as possible, while Helen and Clara's support network helped rebuild shattered lives and restore faith in the community. The river continued its eternal flow, but now it carried hope instead of corruption. Mitchell and Benjamin's story became legend along its banks, not as enemies in a staged duel, but as the catalysts who had exposed the truth and helped justice prevail. The railroad tracks gleamed in the desert sun, no longer symbols of greed but promises of legitimate progress and honest opportunity for all who sought it. The setting sun cast long shadows across Yuma's dusty main street as Benjamin Mitchell watched his young challenger from the window of the Copper River Saloon. The kid couldn't be more than 25, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of carefully orchestrated purpose rather than the typical brash confidence of youth. Behind them both, Alexander Turner counted his betting slips with methodical precision, his expression revealing nothing of the elaborate scheme he'd set in motion months ago. Helen Roberts burst through the saloon doors, her face flushed with urgency. "Benjamin, you can't go through with this. I found proof. The railroad contracts, the betting records, everything." She clutched a leather portfolio to her chest, but Alexander's men were already moving to intercept her. The aging gunslinger's eyes narrowed as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. "Let her speak," Benjamin commanded, his weathered hand resting on his holster. The young challenger, Ethan Phillips, shifted uncomfortably near the bar. Helen spread documents across a table, revealing an intricate web of forgeries and fraud. Alexander Turner had been manipulating land deals along the river, using staged gunfights to drive property values down before the railroad's arrival. Francis Perez, the telegraph operator who had been tracking suspicious betting patterns for months, slipped into the saloon through the back door. She exchanged knowing glances with Helen. Their investigation had finally borne fruit. The two women had discovered that Turner's operation stretched from Flagstaff to Globe, with Yuma as its center point. "Your father didn't die in a fair fight," Helen told Ethan, her voice thick with emotion. "Turner orchestrated that too, just like he's orchestrating this." The young man's face drained of color as he realized he'd been molded into an unwitting weapon of revenge against the wrong man. Benjamin's reputation for never drawing first had made him the perfect target for Turner's schemes. Clara Mitchell, Benjamin's daughter, had suspected something was wrong when land prices along the river began fluctuating wildly. Working at the land office, she'd noticed patterns in property transfers following each of Turner's sponsored duels. Now she stood in the doorway, rifle steady, covering Turner's escape routes. The criminal mastermind's carefully constructed facade cracked as he realized his empire was crumbling. "You're all fools," he snarled, reaching for his hidden derringer. But before he could draw, Ethan's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him into a table of empty glasses. The young man had made his choice: justice over vengeance. Noah Turner, Alexander's estranged brother and the railroad's chief surveyor, stepped forward from the crowd. He'd been gathering evidence of his brother's crimes for months, working with Francis to document the manipulation of land prices and the orchestrated violence that facilitated it. "It ends today, Alexander. The railroad's coming, but not on your terms." As Turner's men were disarmed and detained, Benjamin and Ethan faced each other across the saloon. "Seems we both had parts written for us in someone else's play," the older man said quietly. Ethan nodded, holstering his gun. "My father... Do you know who really killed him?" Benjamin's eyes softened with understanding. "I aim to help you find out, son. The real story, this time." The following weeks saw Turner's network of corruption exposed, with Jacob Roberts, Helen's brother and the territory's circuit judge, presiding over the trials. The railroad continued its inexorable advance. But now the river communities dealt fairly with the company, their prosperity built on honest commerce rather than manufactured bloodshed. Alice Perez, Francis's young daughter, would later write that summer's events into a chronicle that captured the complexity of human nature and the power of truth to heal old wounds. Benjamin and Ethan's near-fatal confrontation had transformed into an unlikely partnership as they worked together to restore justice to the river settlements. Clara took over management of the land office, implementing strict new protocols to prevent future manipulation of property values. Helen's investigative skills found a new home at the territorial marshal's office, while Francis continued monitoring communications for signs of corruption, her telegraph key tapping out messages of warning and hope. The Copper River Saloon still stands in Yuma, its scarred bar and bullet-pocked walls telling tales of that pivotal summer. Visitors can still see the table where Helen spread out her evidence, and old-timers speak of how two men's courage to choose truth over pride helped reshape the territory's future. The railroad brought change, but not the kind Alexander Turner had planned. As the years passed, Benjamin would sometimes sit on his porch overlooking the river, watching the trains roll past. Ethan had found peace after learning the truth about his father's death, and the two men's friendship served as a testament to the power of redemption. The river flowed on, its waters carrying new stories toward the horizon, while the old ones settled into legend. Years after the Turner affair, the ripples of change continued to spread across the territory. The railroad had indeed transformed the landscape, but not into the empire of corruption Alexander Turner had envisioned. Instead, the iron rails became arteries of legitimate commerce, connecting communities that had learned valuable lessons about the true price of progress. Benjamin found himself increasingly called upon to advise the Territorial Council on matters of development and law. His experience with Turner's scheme had given him unique insight into how power could corrupt, and he used this wisdom to help craft regulations that protected both progress and people. The old gunslinger's reputation had evolved from that of a feared shootist to a respected voice of reason. In Prescott, Helen's work with the Marshal's Office led to the creation of a special investigative unit dedicated to preventing land fraud. She trained a new generation of deputies in the art of following paper trails and connecting seemingly unrelated details. The methods she'd developed during the Turner investigation became standard practice across the territory. Frances expanded her network of telegraph operators into what became known as the Wire Watch, a loose confederation of communications workers who monitored for signs of corruption and criminal conspiracy. Her system helped prevent 3 separate attempts to replicate Turner's scheme in other territories, earning her silent recognition from law enforcement across the West. The partnership between Benjamin and Ethan evolved into something neither man had expected. They established a consulting firm in Yuma that specialized in helping communities navigate the complex intersection of progress and tradition. Their reputation for fairness and insight drew clients from as far as San Francisco, though they never forgot their roots along the river. Clara, who had risked everything to expose Turner's true nature, found her calling as a journalist for the territorial newspaper. Her first-hand experience with corruption made her particularly adept at uncovering hidden truths, and her articles became must-read material for anyone interested in territorial politics. The Copper River Saloon underwent its own transformation. Alice, having inherited the establishment, turned it into a gathering place for both the old guard and the new generation. The bullet holes remained, but now they served as conversation pieces that sparked discussions about how close the territory had come to falling under Turner's control. One autumn evening, as Benjamin sat with Ethan on the saloon's newly built riverside deck, they watched a steam locomotive roll past, its whistle echoing across the water. The sound no longer carried the ominous undertones it once had. Instead, it reminded them of how far they'd come from those tense days when every train might have brought more of Turner's men. The river itself seemed to flow more freely now, unburdened by the weight of secrets it had once carried. Local fishermen reported better catches, and the trading posts along its banks flourished with honest commerce. The water that had once witnessed so much deception now reflected the golden light of legitimate prosperity. In Globe, where Turner's influence had once threatened to strangle the town's independence, a new generation of civic leaders emerged. They studied the cautionary tale of Alexander Turner's rise and fall, using it as a blueprint for what to watch for and prevent. The town became known for its transparent governance and strong community oversight. Noah's Old Ranch, once a safe house for those fighting Turner's influence, became a gathering place for territorial leaders seeking to balance progress with preservation. The ancient cottonwoods that had sheltered so many secrets now provided shade for those working to build a better future. Anna's role in preserving crucial documents during the investigation led to the establishment of the Territorial Archives in Flagstaff. The facility became a testament to the importance of maintaining historical records, ensuring that future generations would understand both the dangers and the triumph of that pivotal time. As the century drew to a close, the story of how a handful of determined individuals had thwarted Alexander Turner's grand design became part of the territory's official history. School children learned about the importance of vigilance and integrity, while new settlers heard tales of how the river folk had stood firm against corruption. The legacy of those events continued to influence territorial development well into the new century. The balance between progress and preservation that Benjamin and Ethan had fought so hard to achieve became a model for other expanding territories, proving that growth didn't have to come at the cost of justice.